Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Raben Group event today. I'll be speaking with Roy Austin about policing in America from Rodney King to George Floyd. My name is Justin Wilson, and I'm a director at the Raben Group. Today's guest, Roy Austin, is a partner at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis LLP in DC. Roy previously served in the Obama administration as a deputy assistant on the White House Domestic Policy Council, and before that in various roles in the DOJ. He has been a career trial attorney and is a graduate of Yale and the University of Chicago and a native of State College, Pennsylvania. Thank you to Roy for joining us today to talk about policing and the role that he has played in the federal government throughout his years. Welcome, Roy.
Welcome, Justin. Good to see you again.
Great to have you on here. So let's start with Rodney King and where you were at that time. It was the 80s. You were at Yale as a student. Can you tell us a little bit about how you heard it?
So Rodney King was it was 1991, I believe, when the incident happened. And I was in my senior year of college, and it was. You knew of police brutality, you knew of the issues around policing and race, but Rodney King was kind of that first video for my generation that really defined the criminal justice movement. And I just, I had pretty recently decided I was going to be a lawyer and a civil rights lawyer, and so a lot of passion around seeing what was done to him at that time.
So you said you already knew about police brutality at that point. What was your previous experience? Was it stories around the dinner table? Was it a family experience? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was the dinner table conversations. So my father is a sociologist, criminologist. He was teaching at Penn State at the time. Did a lot of work on juvenile delinquency and on policing. And I think by some form of osmosis, I used to kind of see all of these books around the house and on shelves all over the house dealing with policing, delinquency, criminal justice. And I really took to it as a fairly young man. And then for me personally, it was really just kind of seeing we had the New York news playing all the time. And at 10 p.m., they had this catchphrase that said, "It's 10 p.m., do you know where your children are?" And invariably, it was Black men shot and killed, Black man being chased down, police arresting Black man. And I realized pretty early on that I was just very fortunate to be growing up in the forgiving environment that I was. Despite the lack of diversity, what I was seeing was very different from what other young Black boys and men were seeing in their lives.
Did you feel at all shielded by the fact that your father was a professor, or did you still feel the burden of being kind of a big Black man in State College or at Yale?
So, it goes both ways. Again, I think part of it was, we saw the racism, and my dad spoke of the racism of moving to that town and how there were certain businesses who didn't want to do business with us as a family. How when we were moving into our house, there were people who pretty clearly made it very clear that they didn't want us moving next to them because of what it would do to their property value. We had people soaping the N-word, and go home on our driveway one Halloween, being followed around stores as this young Black kid trying to figure out why are these people following me around. So there's this real understanding. At the same time, we were in the middle of an academic environment. My dad was a professor there, and I, without question, I benefited from the fact that, my parents were educated, raised me in that environment, and that certainly helped me to avoid some of the pitfalls that so many others face. So I was very fortunate where I grew up and how I was raised.
So you're at Yale, you see the footage of Rodney King, you've already decided to be a lawyer at this point. Can you talk to us about the role that seeing the footage played maybe for you and for the greater community that you were in at that time? Like how did it differ from what you normally saw?
Yeah, so that summer, interestingly enough, I had worked as an intern investigator for the Public Defender Service here in Washington, D.C. And for a young man, even though, I was in New Haven for college, and you're in college, you don't necessarily experience the city. I spent my summer driving throughout DC, and I was working for an attorney by the name of Sean Moore, one of the finest defense attorneys that I had ever met, and still believe one of the finest. And he did a lot of homicide cases in the District of Columbia at a time when homicide was really a huge problem in the district. And I was going into all of these different neighborhoods and dealing with people who I didn't necessarily deal with all the time. And it was really, really eye-opening for me, and really put a passion behind the idea of doing public defense work. It instilled it in me. And so, when Rodney King came around and you saw this police brutality, and then you heard more and more stories about these, driving while black and the stops and the racism in the system, that really made it clear to me that I was going to take on a career in law some way or another, and I really thought it was going to be as a public defender.
That's pretty important and pretty striking. The DC at the time, I think, was the murder capital, or very, very highly ranked, if that's the correct word there. So I can imagine that was a pretty crazy experience.
It was.
The footage in Rodney King matters a lot, and we've seen a growth in the amount of footage that we've seen. We're all kind of inundated with body cams and cell phone footage. What role do you feel like that plays in the public's understanding of police brutality and what's faced?
It means everything. It means absolutely everything. I mean, if you look at the civil rights movement, part of what made the civil rights movement successful was that there were cameras there, was that there were people who were seeing the brutality that was happening on the streets, seeing the dogs, seeing the fire hoses. People were seeing that for the first time. And you can't look at that. Well, most of us cannot look at that and not say, okay, there's something wrong. Here are people who are not doing anything to deserve that kind of treatment. And so you take it the same way with Rodney King, and then you move that into what we saw happen to Eric Gardner, what we saw happen to Philando Castile, what we saw happen to Scott. I'm forgetting his first name. In, I believe it was South Carolina, where he was shot in the back, and then the police officer planted a weapon on him. Walter Scott, sorry. To see the treatment of Sandra Bland by that police officer, these are incredibly important, and they verify the stories, because there's so many people who want to give the benefit of the doubt to police always. And if you don't have this videotape, look at Laquan McDonald. If you don't have that in Chicago, if you don't have that video, the police will come up with a story. And I don't say that it's, the police are different from anybody else. I mean, anyone who does wrong, if they can get away with it, most likely is going to come up with a story.
Right.
And so that video brings everyone together to see what happens. And then, of course, we have George Floyd. I mean, again, if you don't have that video and you just have witnesses talking about it, it's a completely different situation than when everyone with their own eyes can see something that tells them this was wrong. This should not have happened. And so it's one reason why I'm a huge proponent of body cameras and dash cameras, even though they're complicated and there are a lot of issues around them. You have to be able to tell those stories. And the video, pictures 1,000 words. Video is probably closer to 1,000,000 words. It really does spell out what has happened and why what has happened is wrong.
So we had the video of Rodney King, and everybody was able to see it. but the officers were still acquitted in the end. How do we reconcile those two things, knowing what we've seen? Because we've seen from Rodney King up to Trayvon Martin to Walter Scott, who fortunately was prosecuted, but we've seen many cases where we have seen the footage and the results haven't been quote unquote in our favor. People haven't been prosecuted or convicted. How do we reconcile that?
So, with Rodney King, the first trial, the state trial, there was acquittal of all four officers. And thankfully, there is no double jeopardy with respect to the federal government. And the federal government was then able to come in using 18 United States Code 242 and prosecute those officers federally. Two of them are acquitted. Two of them were found guilty and served 26 months in prison for what they did to Rodney King. So in some ways, the system worked. Now, you look back at that state acquittal and you're wondering what happened. Well, you look at where the case was tried, you look at who the jurors were, and it's the importance of having a diverse jury, it's the importance of having diverse district attorneys and prosecutors. It's the importance of having diverse communities where people can honestly look at a situation and say that this, in fact, was wrong. I mean, they were able to sully the reputation of Rodney King to make it appear to at least that first group of jurors, not that the officers did what was right, but that Rodney King's life did not matter and did not matter as much as other people. And look, I've seen this done in civil rights cases, kind of as a regular strategy by those defending police misconduct, and that is that we will blame the victim for what the police did to the victim. And so, the situation is one in which we need to ensure that we have courts that are fair, judges that are fair, prosecutors that are aggressive and willing to hold police officers accountable. And we need to keep educating our communities to make sure that our communities understand that whether or not police officers have a tough job or not is not the question. The question is whether or not, when we give someone that kind of power, that we also require them to be accountable for the use of that power and not to use it in ways that are abusive, discriminatory, violent, and vicious.
Speaking of prosecutor empowerment, we want those prosecutors to be aggressive. How do we empower them to do so? Obviously, in some places, prosecutors are appointed. In other places, prosecutors are elected. But how do we empower prosecutors to take that onus to go after some of the police officers who are committing these vicious crimes against our communities?
Look, it's like so much, and so much of what we're talking about right now is vote, is we need people to be voting. We have seen very recently, and people don't realize how recent this is, but the idea of the reform-minded prosecutor is brand new in this country. For years and years and years, and this is something James Foreman, professor at Yale Law School, talked about in his book, Policing Their Own, I think it's the name of the book, was that even Black politicians and liberal politicians were advocating kind of a law and order that we saw happening. We right now have prosecutors who are looking at the system, and when I say prosecutors, I'm talking about Aramis Ayala out of Orlando, I'm talking about Kim Fox in Chicago, I'm talking about Kim Gardner in St. Louis, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, Satana DeBerry, Rachel Rollins, Larry Krasner, Chesa Boudin. I mean, the fact that I can name so many names, these are prosecutors who are looking at their job and looking at the situation in a way that we have never really seen. And that is a recognition that part of the problem with our criminal justice system is that it has not been just, is that it has been discriminatory in all of our decision making, from over policing minor crimes. This is the broken windows style policing, where we over police minor crimes in certain neighborhoods that happen to largely be Black and brown and Native, and we don't do anything about those crimes in their white neighborhoods. And we have to stop doing that realize that we actually have to look at who our prosecutors are. What is the race of our prosecutors? There's still very few African American and Latino prosecutors in this country, and we need to increase those numbers. We have to recognize that when we make decisions on pleas, like who are we offering plea bargains to? Who are we offering pretrial release to? What is our bail system doing? All of these systems are in fact, and current Attorney General Bill Barr is just flat out wrong on this. There is systemic racism in these systems of criminal justice, and it has existed since at least the 60s. But if we look at the slave patrols and why policing grew the way it did, and we look at what was happening during Reconstruction, and again why policing and law enforcement grew the way it did, and you understand that these systems were created to exacerbate the racism that was happening in the society around them, and that we are basically living in a realm of self-fulfilling prophecies. If you over-police the Black and brown communities of this country, you are going to find more Black and brown people who you can incarcerate. And when you take poverty and you take people who don't have money to pay for their fines and fees and bail, and you lock them up and you destroy families in that way, then you can't be surprised at the results. So what we have is a group of prosecutors who we need to continue to support and defend, who are looking at the system differently and recognizing that, yeah, we have to do something about crime in this country, but we have to make sure we're not doing it in a way that is discriminating against certain members of our society.
Many people would say, based on what you said, that the systems that were put in place were never built for us, so they shouldn't be here. Do you believe that the system can be reformed internally with diversity in prosecution and more diverse judges, et cetera? Or do we need to rethink the way this looks completely and maybe start from the ground up?
So let me take the cop-out approach to your question and say both.
Okay.
I think we do need to rethink. I think we need to completely reimagine public safety. We have to really figure out what it is that we want and what it is we want out of those who we entrust with our public safety. Because let's be honest, like let's take an example of marijuana use. Study after study has found that marijuana use is the same across races. Nonetheless, for the crime of possession of marijuana, Black people are arrested and convicted at a much higher rate than our white people. Do those white people who use marijuana or know their friends and neighbors are using marijuana or their kids are using marijuana, do they want the police to just as aggressively pursue that the purchase, sale, use, possession of marijuana as they do in the Black community? Do they want that? And if they want that, then let's go for that. Okay, let's have the jump out squad show up at the white institutions, the white high schools. Let's have them show up at your cocktail parties and everything else. Or do we want to decide that these things need a different solution to them, and that maybe putting people in jail for something as minor as marijuana possession is a mistake? We have to look at traffic stops. Police officers perform, I don't know how many traffic stops. And what they do is they perform a traffic stop, not because in most instances they care that someone was going 10 miles over the speed limit or that someone changed a lane in a way that seemed improper, but they use it as a pretext to dig in further. When the police officer approaches that car and they see a Black person, they're more likely to ask for to search that car, or to demand that they're going to search that car, or to hold that person up while they bring a drug dog in to search that car than they do with a white person. Well, that's wrong. And do we really want our police to? And not only is it wrong, but it's inefficient. It's waste of time and money, because the vast majority of the time that they have that Black person sitting on the side of the road, they're not going to find any contraband. They're not going to find any drugs. They're not going to find any illegal weapons. They're not going to find anything. So our police officers are just guessing. They're just guessing, and most of the time they're going to guess against people who are Black or brown. So maybe we have to completely rethink a system that allows police officers to guess. And we don't have any computer algorithm that's going to tell us how this is going to work, and we can't remove the racism of this decision making by some implicit bias training. It's got to be stronger. It's got to be more powerful than that. So we have to reimagine. At the same time, we are a very scarily violent society. We see 14,000 to 16,000 murders every year. We have rapes, we have robberies, we have burglaries. These are things that the Black community, the white community, the brown community, every community wants stopped. They want their public safety back. Who's going to give them their public safety back? And who's going to protect them when these things happen? And then we have to relook at all the problems. Is drug use a medical problem, a mental health problem, or is it a criminal justice problem? Homelessness, is that a medical problem, a mental health problem, a social services problem, or a criminal justice problem? So many of the things that we treat as criminal justice problems are probably not criminal justice problems, and we need a solution outside of the criminal justice system to deal with those issues. And so I'm going to give you an answer that is both. We need to reform the current system, but we also have to completely reimagine what we are doing with respect to, we have to completely reimagine what we are doing with respect to public safety and criminal justice.
Thank you for that. I'll stop right there and just remind people that they can put their questions in the comment section and we'll answer as many as we can later in the program, probably in the next 20 minutes or so. So please, any questions you have for Roy, please include in the comment section. Roy, as we talk about shifting policing and how we're thinking about the resources that we're allocating to it, one of the movements that we've seen pop up very recently is the defund the police or abolish the police movement. What is your understanding of what it means to defund the police? Can we talk about what that actually looks like?
Yeah, so So let me be very honest with you. I'm not a fan of the defund the police movement.
Okay.
And that's because words have meaning, and defund to me means defund. And there are so many people surrounding the defund the police movement and say, well, I don't mean defund, I mean transform. I mean, let's look at police, let's reimagine police. Let's look to increasing social services. So look, I'm all for reimagining. I'm all for moving more resources to social services. I think those are things that we need to do. But we have a catchphrase that sets people off in a way that they shouldn't even be set off because, there's common sense behind, do we treat addiction as a crime? Knowing that when we lock people up who are addicted and then let them back on our streets, they don't come back without that addiction. And oftentimes they come back worse. Knowing that when we pull a mother or a father away from a family and incarcerate them for something that they don't need to be incarcerated from, that there are children, that there is a community that loses by not having that parent in the home raising their children. So I want to have that conversation, but I don't want to have that conversation with a term that is so loaded. And look, plain language is Justin, you went to law school. Plain language is one of the basic tenets of the law. And when you say defund the police, that sounds like you're saying remove all the funding from the police. And I don't think that's where we are. Now, look, there are abolitionists out there. There are people who actually believe we need to get rid of police, get rid of prosecutors. And, I'll be honest with you, I think they should have a seat at the table to discuss their ideas. I want to have all these ideas out there, but I also want the police union to have a seat at the table to discuss their ideas and to have a very honest conversation around these issues. So where I am is, look, we have an incredibly violent society. Most people don't realize that the clearance rate in this country for homicides is approximately 61%. Clearance rate. That's not even convictions. That's people, if you have a homicide, in 61% of the cases, someone is arrested for that homicide. What that means is that in 39% of the cases, no one is arrested. So we can talk all we want to about how many marijuana and drug possession cases we've done, but we're not doing anything about violent crime, and we're pouring millions and millions of dollars into a system that is supposed to be keeping us safer. And I don't care kind of which administration we talk about.
Hmm.
The numbers don't really move on our clearance rates. The numbers don't significantly move on our crime rates and our violent crime rates. So we have to do something different. I mean, that's, we've heard the cliche about the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Well, for decades now, since we've been kind of talking tough on crime, we've been talking tough on crime and not really move the needle as much as one would hope that we would have. So maybe it's time to talk about our education system, our healthcare system, our housing situation in a way that we've never talked about these things before. And look, you'll have police officers and police chiefs who have for decades talked about the fact you are sending your social problems to us, expecting us to solve them, and then to go kind of overboard on the cliches. If your only tool is a hammer, everything you see is a nail.
Right,
So
right.
for police officers, I mean, their main tool is to arrest people. That's their main tool. And so if you set up a system where you make police the head of your social problems, well, what are they going to do? They're going to try to arrest their way out of a problem that we just simply can't arrest our way out of.
That's very helpful. It's very helpful. You said that no administration has really made that much of a difference as we look at policing as a whole, dating back through the years. You remember the Obama administration, where you worked on 21st century policing initiative. And we're in the era, in the stage of big data. Everybody wants numbers, everybody wants statistics. You've spoken about the clearance rate and other rates as it pertains to criminal justice. What did that 21st century policing initiative show you? What were you able to glean from that? What were kind of the goals there?
Enormous potential, enormous potential. We were starting to see some serious change, and I really do believe that President Obama and Vice President Biden were doing some amazing work around policing to kind of get us to start rethinking it in a way that had not been done. And this is why I said that we have to keep reminding people of this. The idea of criminal justice reform being cool, being something that was that most people in this country wanted, is brand new. I think I was sitting in the administration when the shift happened, and the shift happened for a number of reasons. One reason why the shift happened is we were just pouring too much money into criminal justice, into who we were locking up, and a lot of communities realized that we can't keep spending our money building jails and prisons and locking people up. So that was a big part of it, and that was happening at the Department of Justice, where then Attorney General Eric Holder saw this and initiated his smart on crime policy. But we were seeing it in states like Texas and Connecticut, as red and as blue as you can get, completely remaking their criminal justice systems. You have to remember President Obama visited El Reno prison in Oklahoma. The idea of humanizing people who were incarcerated and having a president be the one to do that was brand new. So we were seeing this shift, and then you had the Michael Brown killing in Ferguson, Missouri, and the protests that came out of that, and the movement that was started with that, the Black Lives Matter movement. And that, and I may be wrong on my timing that may have started post Trayvon Martin's killing, but it's still all of that was happening during the Obama administration. The Task Force on 21st Century Policing was an attempt to professionalize policing, make it like so many other areas that we want to see professionalized. And we saw, and the recommendations that came out of it were not groundbreaking recommendations, but the diversity of the people on that, everything from Chuck Ramsey to Brittany Packnett, everything from Sue Rahr in Seattle to Brian Stevenson, to Tracy Mears, the diversity of ideas and the support that those people had with those ideas. And at the table, and the people who talked to us, Sean Smoot from the police unions, we had everyone who was credible on these issues moving in the same direction, saying that things have to change. And then we had an election, a president who refused to acknowledge the history of systemic racism in policing, and who defended the excessive use of force by law enforcement, completely changed the move that we were seeing making. And let's be clear that the move that has to be made in policing is that culture has to change. And culture change does not happen overnight. It takes time. And so we were seeing department after department around the country adopt the Task Force on 21st Century recommendations, look deep into their practices and their policies to see if they should shift them, see where they had to make moves. We were seeing advertisements for police chiefs that required the applicants to have a working knowledge of the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. We saw post police officer standards and training, the main training organization in every state, requiring that they match and that they follow the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. We were seeing massive changes, but that happened in the last year or so of the administration. Mm-hmm. It needed time, and then we just simply ran out of time. And so the killing of George Floyd, though, has pushed this matter beyond even what the Task Force on 21st Century Policing was talking about. So I think we are now at a place where the ideas that are floating around are bigger, and are saying we can't simply look at reform. We really have to be looking at reimagining.
Yeah. Apologies for a little technical difficulty there on my part. One of the ideas that has been floating around very recently has been the idea of ending qualified immunity. So what is qualified immunity, and why are people throwing around the idea of ending
it? So qualified immunity is the way that individual police officers in civil cases avoid any accountability for their actions. So when they raise the flag of qualified immunity, they are immune from a civil lawsuit that points out that what they did was against the law, was against policy. And so that is why this is such an important issue. And it's a judge created idea. There's no real law on this issue beyond what judges have created. And so that is what we saw in the Justice in Policing Act, is the start of the end of qualified immunity. Because look, if I were to assault you, Justin, you should have every right to sue me for doing that. But if I were a police officer who assaulted you, and you're told, well, you know what? There's no exact case in the federal appellate courts where Roy Austin punched Justin Wilson, so Roy Austin gets qualified immunity. You would scratch your head and say that's nonsense. That's bunk. But that's what qualified immunity is that unless there is the exact case that has already happened that an appellate court has ruled on, that largely the officer gets away with it. And that's nonsense. If someone does wrong to someone else, they should not have immunity for doing that. And I should be able, or you in this case, since I'm the one who assaulted you in my example, you should be able to sue and be compensated for what was done to you. So it's a silly court-created, court-made idea that we need to get rid of. Flat out, period, we need to get rid of it. Because if one person does someone else wrong, that person should face the consequences for that, period.
As we look at a case like Breonna Taylor's, where her family was recently awarded $12 million from the Louisville Police Department, does that fall under qualified immunity, or how does that differ or relate to the topic?
Yeah, so I mean, that's not against the officers themselves. The people who pulled the trigger are not being held accountable for pulling the trigger. The people who came up with the plan that they were going to shoot wildly into a home are not the ones facing the repercussions. So technically in Breonna Taylor, we are paying, not we, but let's say the community in Louisville are paying for the misconduct of a police department. So the police department itself and the officers themselves face no repercussions. So if I'm a police officer and you tell me that the city is giving $12 million to the family of Breonna Taylor, I'm like, so what? It doesn't affect my paycheck. It's spread across every taxpayer in Louisville. I don't have to change my behavior in any way, shape, or form because there are no personal repercussions to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the problem is you can't sue the officer themselves. And the thinking behind reforming qualified immunity is if I have a personal stake in making a mistake, I'm less likely to make that mistake.
Right.
But if I spread it across an entire community, you know what? Why am I going to change my behavior? And it's fully insured. I mean, that 12 million didn't even necessarily come from the taxpayers. It comes from the insurance company, most likely. And so no one is necessarily going to change their behavior, no matter how much money was given to this family. And most importantly for this family, Breonna Taylor is not coming back. And there's going to be another Breonna Taylor because we haven't changed the behavior. That's the problem with qualified immunity.
Brief detour. Talk to us a little bit about the insurance. I don't think that I knew about the police officer's insurance in that way, and how it would cover a case like that.
Oh, so I mean, every city has liability insurance, and sometimes they're self-insured, and sometimes it comes from an outside insurance. And so where you see all these multi-million-dollar verdicts or even smaller verdicts, it's not the individual city, and a lot of cities just set up funds beforehand, and so it's just taxpayer funded money that is used to settle these lawsuits. And so that's that's the way insurance works. If there's an accident, insurance kind of calculates how much money it needs to have on hand to pay off for that accident.
Right.
The problem is, and this is something that we looked at and I think needs to be looked at more and more, is whether we can get insurance companies on board to demand certain changes by law enforcement to ensure that to reduce their risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so they require, the things in the Justice and Policing Act where you set a national federal standard on use of force, where you look into the accountability systems, where you enlarge Section 18 United States Code 242 to allow the federal government to prosecute more cases of police misconduct. The question is whether or not getting insurance companies behind those efforts may in fact be a very effective way to demand change. Like, I'm not going to insure your police department unless you take these 10 steps.
Right.
Well, if you can't get insurance and that money is actually coming from the city itself, you may get a change in behavior. The other thing we've seen, and this is really troubling and problematic, is you always hear about police officers being suspended for 10 days for misconduct. And let's be honest, it's like everything else. If I let you get away with abusing someone in public, okay, and then I say, oh, that's fine, don't worry about it. And then I let you get away with hitting someone wrongly with a baton, and then I don't do anything about that. Well, the shooting comes next.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have is, so you have these police officers who end up getting like 3-day suspension or 5-day suspension. And it's not like police officers in most cases make a ton of money. So you actually have a repercussion. Well, the police unions have basically created insurance for police officers who face any kind of discipline where they pay them. So if you get 5 days, and in numerous unions, if you get 5 days suspended, the police union will pay you for those 5 days. So you technically just got a 5-day vacation, fully paid vacation. So again, what is the incentive to change your behavior if you face no personal repercussions for your bad behavior or for your misconduct? That's got to stop. They should not be able to fund, to raise money, to pay for an officer. And look, most of the disciplinary systems don't work anyway. The investigations are poor, bad behavior they get away with. But on those few occasions where a police officer actually gets suspended without pay, to have the unions step in to pay that officer, that in and of itself is a crime. That in and of itself is an enormous problem and should be disallowed.
As someone who's prosecuted police officers, of all the things that you've named, what did you feel like was the hardest part of getting to an actual conviction? We know the conviction rate against police officers is incredibly low. How do we actually get there in cases of violence against the community?
You know, it's simply the benefit of the doubt that's given to police officers. That's the most challenging thing. Is all the police officer has to say is, I was afraid for my life. I was afraid for my partner's life, so I used excessive force. And it's, you know, as I stated, it sounds as silly as it oftentimes is. You destroy the victim's reputation. You know, the victim used drugs. The victim was arrested in the past. The victim, you know, you dirty the victim, and then there's this impression that you know, that police officers, that every single decision they make is a unbelievable, scary decision that they have to make with no thought at all. And whoops, sometimes there's collateral damage from that. We have to stop that thinking. We have to recognize that police officers are given enormous power, and when you get enormous power, you have enormous responsibility. We have to recognize that you have to do better, that we cannot have over 1,000 people killed by police each and every year. We've got to do better than that. Now, look, police officers are injured, but for every 1,000 people, civilians who are killed every year by police, there are about 50 officers that are killed feloniously every year. Again, these are estimates over the last few years. And I don't want to see 50 police officers dead, but I also don't want to see 1,000 civilians dead. And we have to come up with a system that stops both of those things from happening. And right now, under this current administration, the fact that 1,000 people are killed by police every day is something which they don't even care about. Which they're like, well, you know what? I think as the president said, you know, oh, that police officer choked. Okay, we got to do better than that. That's ignorant. That's crazy. And we can't continue to defend misconduct on those who we give this amount of power to.
Absolutely. We'll start taking some audience questions now as we talk about the administration. The first question is, what can we do to address police brutality under a new administration? So from Brian, what's the hope there? What steps can be taken?
Look, Kamala Harris had an incredibly strong criminal justice plan when she was running for president. Joe Biden had an incredibly strong criminal justice plan when he was running for president. After it was clear that Joe Biden was going to be our nominee, his team sat down with a team largely picked by Bernie Sanders, and they had an incredibly strong plan to deal with criminal justice reform and the criminal justice system. And the Justice and Policing Act that was passed by the House, bipartisan Criminal Justice and Policing Act that was passed by the House that the Senate has chosen to ignore, would move things in the absolute right direction. Again, limiting qualified immunity, setting federal standards for use of force, for looking into the accountability system that is really problematic with respect to law enforcement. For example, I mean, let me just put out another one of these silly things that exist. So police officers do not have to give a statement when they are involved in a use of force for, in most cases, 48 hours, though in some places a week. Why? Because this trained officer is supposedly so stressed by the fact that they pulled the trigger that they can't possibly be asked to give a statement immediately. I want you to go to any witness of a violent crime and ask them whether the police said to them, hey, come back to us in 2 days and give us a statement about what you just saw. It's a completely silly rule that allows the police officer to sit down with his or her union rep, to sit down with his or her friends and family, and to come up with the best possible story. And in some cases, to even get a chance to watch the video of what they did so that they can ensure that their story matches the video.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is the kind of silliness that exists. This is the kind of thing we have to get rid of. We have to be willing to fire and dismiss officers who are bad early on. We have to make sure that we are collecting data on when officers are using force, who they're using force about. We have to really work on early warning systems to make sure that officers who are engaged in misconduct are identified early and lose their police powers early. There are a ton of things, and I've seen in the plans of President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, their nominees, I've seen in their plans some real movement in the right direction.
Okay. Vice President Biden and Senator Harris have both been particularly tough on crime in the past. Biden is often credited with the crime bill, as well as Kamala Harris's work in California. How do we hold them accountable for their past tough on crime policies and the issues that might have created in policing now?
So, to be completely honest with you, I think we have to look forward. We have to look forward, and we have to look at what Vice President Biden did in his 8 years in the Obama administration and what his current plans are. I think we have to look at what Kamala Harris did as Attorney General, as a senator, and what she has promised to do, both as a presidential candidate and as a vice presidential candidate. I think that the past is complicated. I think it's complicated because there are things in the crime bill which I think rightfully troubled some people, but there was also the creation of the pattern or practice authority that we now use when we enter into consent decrees with New Orleans and Los Angeles and Portland and Seattle and East Haven, Connecticut, and Maricopa County, Arizona. And so, but I think, and look, again, I want to point us to James Foreman's book, where Vice President Biden was when he was passing the crime bill, is where the vast majority of African American leaders were, and the African American community was when that crime bill was passing. But we as a country have come to the realization that tough on crime policies are problematic, and the way that they are pursued is problematic. And I think we have to look at what Vice President Biden, Senator Harris have done over at least the last 8 to 10 years with respect to criminal justice, to know for a fact that what they are going to do is going to make a better, more fair, more just system. And that is quite obvious to me. And I think there's also some cherry picking of facts that happens with their past records on these issues. And I think that their records on these issues is actually significantly stronger than people are willing to give them credit for.
Our next question is from Brenda about messaging in the media and perception of victims. How do we win the messaging war when it comes to the victims in the media? And what can we as individuals do to help others see beyond reputation and previous wrongdoing? So how do we stop that smear campaign that you were talking about that happens to victims?
You know, I think first and foremost, it's to look internally, look at ourselves. There are very few among us who haven't made significant and serious mistakes in our lives. And if every time we make a mistake in our lives, the police show up to shoot and kill us, then that's a huge problem. I mean, there are very few perfect people in this world who haven't been in a situation that if a wrong turn was made, if a wrong decision was made, could not be used as an excuse. And I say this, you know, there are a lot of people out there who use recreational drugs, illegal recreational drugs. There are a lot of people out there who drive drunk. There are a lot of people out there who, as young people, did really stupid things. There are a lot of young people out there who walk around with toy guns, also known as Tamir Rice. Okay, not doing anything wrong. And so I think first of all is to look deeply into ourselves and to realize that we are not perfect. You know, the number of people out there who are dealing with some kind of mental health condition. And when the parents call to get help for that individual who has a mental health condition, they don't expect that the police are going to show up and kill that person.
Mm-hmm.
They expect that that person is going to receive the help that they need. And so again, we have to look at ourselves in our own communities and not pretend like there are all these perfect individuals who the police leave alone and all these bad individuals who the police end up engaging in excessive force or unconstitutional policing with. That what the police do can happen to all of us. But then you add in the element of race, and that's where you end up with a huge problem. So that's the first part of it. And look, and that's part of what has kind of won this conversation about criminal justice reform, is a realization that because a 20-year-old kid did something stupid does not mean that we need to destroy their life forever. Because a 25-year-old father has done something stupid does not mean that we necessarily have to ruin their life forever. The fact that we are a society that is forgiving, that there is punishment, that there is restitution, but at the same time, more importantly, is that when we look forward, that we ensure that it doesn't happen again, or we look forward and we identify what is the problem that led that person to do that. Look, I'm not saying that every single person who we incarcerate needs to be let out immediately, but they don't need to be there for as long as they do, and we can't have a system that deals with that really the main currency or the sizable currency is systemic racism. We can't have that be the way we do criminal justice. And we have to look at the fairness of the system. We have to look at why 26% of the people shot and killed by police are African American, though African Americans only represent 13% of the population, why close to 30% of the unarmed people, 30 to 40% of the unarmed people who are shot and killed by police are Black. And again, we represent only 13% of the population. We have to look at that. We have to keep protesting. We have to keep protesting. We have to see all 2,000 plus cities and towns that protested for Black Lives Matter have to keep talking, have to keep speaking, have to keep demanding change. And so that's how we change the conversation here. I mean, I was very surprised to see Black Lives Matter as a term, as a movement, catch fire like it has. But people suddenly started looking at themselves, looking at their schools, looking at their communities, all white communities marching and saying Black Lives Matter, putting up Black Lives Matter placards in front of their homes. I think we as largely the majority of this country of ours recognizes that we have a huge problem with systemic racism. Now, a few very loud and powerful people ignore that problem, but we're a democracy. And if we all vote and if we all speak our minds, I think we'll end up in the right place at the end of the day.
The last question I have is about police unions. Do substantive changes require changes to collective bargaining for police, or the influence on police unions?
So look,
Thanks for that, William.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And look, you're talking to a progressive here. I believe in unions. I believe in the importance of unions. But we can't allow police unions to be more powerful than every other union. Most unions have very limited influence on discipline. For some reason, we've given police unions this incredible power over discipline and accountability systems. Again, I pointed out the whole when a police officer has to give a statement. I mean, that should have nothing to do with a police union. That's simply the power. And what the unions have done is, by their sheer numbers, the Fraternal Order of Police recently endorsed President Trump, 300,000 members. In the past, that would actually be kind of worrisome. But what we've seen is that with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the protest movement and with so many and with the rise of the reform-minded prosecutor, is that doesn't matter anymore. that what matters anymore and what should matter most of all is truth. And the truth of the matter is that the police union should be just like every other union. They should be able to fight for the working conditions of their officers. They should be able to collectively bargain the salaries of their officers. But they shouldn't have a say in whether or not an officer that is engaged in misconduct is disciplined for that. They shouldn't have a say in paying an officer who has been disciplined. They shouldn't be able to do that. And so again, they need to be treated like and have the same power as any other union. And I think that's what needs to happen there. And look, those same police unions that are now endorsing President Trump sat at the table with President Obama. Mm-hmm. They recognize power when they see it. And so should there be a President Biden, Vice President Harris, they will come to the table and they will have to reckon with changes in the way that they do things. So I'm not worried about them because they will come to the table if we elect people who demand accountability by police officers who do wrong.
Thank you for a great conversation today, Roy. The very last question I'll ask is, where do we go from here? We started Rodney King. We've taken it all the way to George Floyd. What's next as we continue to look forward towards the election season?
So, Justin, let me just start by saying a huge thank you to you. We've worked on these issues and other issues for years now, and I really appreciate the intelligence and the passion that you bring to these issues. And I appreciate you and the Raben Group having me here. Look, the bottom line is that we vote. That's the be all and end all of everything right now. Is we vote and we insist on a free and fair election, because we have to turn this around, and we keep protesting. People have to keep marching. People have to keep raising their voices. People have to keep fighting for truth and justice. And I think if we do those things, we'll be all right, and we'll figure this out. And we'll have a justice system. I don't want to say criminal justice system, a justice system that we can all be proud of. So thank you again.
Thanks for that, Roy. A reminder to everybody that today is National Voter Registration Day. So definitely encourage you to find your early voting locations if early voting is allowed in your state. If you are voting absentee, to get started on that process so that we can all do our part and vote. Tomorrow, the Raben Group will be hosting Senator Murphy from Connecticut, who has become the best known leader in Congress in confronting the plague of gun violence in America since the Newtown school shooting in December of 2012. My colleague, Audrey Lopez, a director at the Raben Group, will guide the discussion tomorrow at 7 p.m. So we encourage you to tune into that. Thank you to everybody who took the time to watch today. And again, thank you to Roy. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and enjoy the good fall weather. Bye-bye.